I was enjoying my life as a Bible teacher and evangelist. I used to go into universities and do university evangelistic missions. Christian unions would invite me in for a week, and I would go and preach in the bars and clubs. And I used to do Bible teaching around brethren assemblies and other churches in England. And in 1970-71, I started getting invited to OM conferences to do the Bible teaching. I was a guest. I was really looked after. And then in 1973, I got a phone call from George Døre. We've just lost our UK director. He's gone to do another job. And I'm really struggling. Is there any way you could come and help for 1 year as the UK director while I find someone else? That 1 year has been a very, very long year indeed. So I've been involved in mission now, mission with OM, for almost 40 years. And I want to talk to you about some of the differences which we're seeing in the world of mission during those 40 years, and differences which we can expect to see in the future as well. So imagine you've been in OM 40 years ago. You went away and you came back today. What would be the differences that you would see? Well, the first difference you would see, undoubtedly, would be the globalization of the missionary force. So 73, most of the people working with OM were from Europe, they were from North America, they were from Australia, they were from New Zealand, they were from Canada and so on. People went in those days, not just in OM, but in the world of missions. They went from the West to the rest. That was the focus of mission. They went from the Christian Western world to the non-Christian rest of the world. Well, missions has been hugely successful by the grace of God. And I'm going to show you in the evening session just how successful missions has become. I don't know if you still think of missions in that way. I come across Christians today who still think as people thought 40 years ago. They think the mission fields are over there. Do you still come across Christians there? Mission fields, yeah, that's Latin America, Africa, and Asia. No. That's the place where the church is growing today. Mission fields are as much Europe today, as much Denmark today, as Africa, Asia, probably, possibly even more. One of the places which we've seen church growth in, quite remarkably, has been the land of Korea. And I've just been reading a book on Korean missions. Here's the facts about South Korea. In the year 1900, so that's what, 113 years ago, 12 years ago, the number of Christians in the whole country, South Korea, in 1900, was 42,000. And they were mainly Roman Catholic Christians. So 42,000, mainly Roman Catholics. From 1900 to 1910, that increased by just 9,000. So 51,000 by 1910. From 1910 to 1950, it went from 9,000 to 1.6 million. But then from 1950 to 1970, it went from 1.6 million to 6 million. Then from 1970 to 2000, it went from 6 million to 19.5 million. And today, it's estimated there's about 21 million Christians in South Korea. And about 90% of them in the year 1980, about 90% of them were evangelical Protestants. And by 2000, it was down to about 75% evangelical Protestants. So liberalism has hit the South Korean church in the last 20, 30 years. But they're also sending out an astonishing number of missionaries. In 1979, the Korean church sent out 93 missionaries. By 2000, that's 21 years later, 8,103 missionaries. 10 years later, 20,500 missionaries. So more than 13% of the global Protestant missionary force today is from South Korea. And that's expected to increase up to 20%, one-fifth of the missionary force by the year 2030. So what were the mission fields have become mission-sending nations. And what were the mission-sending nations, our European nations, have become the mission fields. And that's happened in my sort of missionary lifetime, and in the lifetime of most of us here today. Same can be said of China. China is sending huge numbers of missionaries already, and it's expecting to send many, many more. The Africans are coming. That's the sort of word amongst mission groups in Africa. The Africans are coming. They're going to be sending thousands of missionaries in the coming years. And Latin America is also sending many, many missionaries as well. So that's the first big change you see in the world of missions. And it's a huge change which many Christians have just not grasped. They still think in that very old-fashioned way of the West being Christian and the rest needing Christianity, when in fact it's been turned on its head. Now that brings some challenges into the world of missions, because most of the missionary societies that these mission groups are working with are Western missionary groups. They were started by Westerners, they're structured in Western ways. And for the last 10 years I've been meeting with missionary leaders. We meet once every 2 years, and the talk amongst international directors of missionary societies when we meet is, how can we make the mission organizations more comfortable for non-Westerners to meet in or to work in? Just interesting looking at how we're structured here this evening. Rows of people. You're all looking at the backs of people's heads. Now, we used to do this in OM, you see. We'd have these big international leaders meetings where we discuss big issues. We'd all sit in rows, and I'd ask for contributions. And Westerners would stand up all over the place, and they would speak. And Asians and Africans couldn't get them to speak. So I would talk to these Asian and African leaders. How do we get you guys to contribute? Well, don't put them in big groups like this. And certainly don't put them in rows. Put them in smaller groups where they can see one another. So, sit in circles maybe rather than in rows, because body language is so important to Asians particularly. And all of a sudden we're restructuring our sort of business meetings in OM. We now have to discuss business first in small groups. Then we have an opportunity to feed back, and then people need to go away and think about it, because many non-Westerners, they're reflective thinkers. They need to have 24 hours or 48 hours to think about something, and then contribute. And then come back to a plenary session and finally make a decision. So it takes a bit longer than it used to take. But we have to adapt to the multicultural nature of Christian mission. So that's the first thing. The second thing that you would notice if you came back into OM today, if you'd been around 40 years ago, the second big change would be the holistic approach to mission that you'll experience in Operation Mobilization today. So 40 years ago, you'd go knocking doors, giving out literature, preaching on the street corner. That still happens in certain parts of OM today, but there's a much more holistic approach to Christian mission. I would have sat bemused on that front row watching that arts thing 40 years ago. I would have thought, what's all that about? Artists using their skills in Christian mission? We never used to think like that 40 years ago. So holistic mission, you need to understand it in two ways. Number one, holistic mission is reaching the whole, holistic, the whole of a human being. Not just his spirit, but his body, if he's in physical need, his mind, his emotions, ministering to the whole of man. That's one way to understand holistic mission. The other way of understanding holistic mission is you, with all your skills, all your abilities, all your training, that can be used in mission. So today, for example, not just arts in mission, but sports in mission. It's one of the big strategies in mission and certainly in OM today. People using their sporting skills to get alongside people and ultimately to share their faith with people. People using business in mission. This is a huge phenomenon in the world of mission today. People with business skills establishing businesses in the name of Jesus in areas where maybe there's a lot of corruption, and you go into an area and you run a business on Christian principles. Let me give you one example. It's an example from the Muslim world, where a couple went out to one of the stands, Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, I don't quite remember which one it was, but before they went out there, they went to the British Museum and they got the patterns of carpets that this country used to produce before the Russians came in and obliterated the sort of local culture. So they went into this Muslim town where there was no church, no Christians, and they set up a carpet weaving business employing local women, Muslim women. Now before these guys arrived in this village, if you were a woman and you wanted to get a job, it was almost taken for granted that you had to have sex with the boss to get a job. It was just part of getting the job. And then you were paid a pittance of a wage, and you were treated very much as a slave. And this couple go in, they're not looking for sex if you want a job. They pay you a reasonable wage, and they treat you with dignity as a human being. And all of a sudden, just as I was saying in the first session, people are asking questions. Why? You obviously could be making a lot of money in the West with the skills that you have. Why have you come here? Why do you treat us like this? And the first baptism in human memory took place in that town 4 years ago, when 12 of the women who were in the carpet weaving factory were baptized, and 9 of their husbands are at least showing interest in Christianity. So an holistic approach to mission, seeking to touch the whole of man, the whole of a community in the name of Jesus, using all the skills, all the training that people have to bring the gospel message. I sometimes say to people, whatever your training, whatever your qualification, God can use it somewhere in his world. And I was in a meeting recently and a man came to me and he said, I'm a taxidermist. Where can you use me? Do you know what a taxidermist is? It's a person who takes dead animals and stuffs them as pieces of art. Well, I did struggle to find out where we could use a taxidermist in the world of mission. So that's the second big change. Number 1, the globalization of the missionary force. Number 2, the holistic nature of Christian mission. Number 3, the globalization of culture. This is a huge phenomenon in the last 30 or 40 years. So we today have, in many parts of the world at least, a global culture. So people in the towns of India, the young people in the towns of India, are singing the same songs as young people here in Denmark or the UK or America. We call it the Mac culture, the McDonald culture. Everywhere you go in the world there's the big M. McDonald's, Pizza Hut. The English language is a huge phenomenon in the world today. You know the most popular program on Chinese television? It's an English language program where Chinese by the million are trying to learn English, because many people think that's the way you can progress in the world today, by learning English. This has got some incredible benefits for mission. We can communicate to billions of people today through the English language. Preachers can go on television and they can preach, and people all over the world can understand them and listen to them. But it's also got some problems as well. This globalization of culture is being resisted by many societies, many communities. People see that this global culture is not Christian. It's from the West, but it's not Christian. In fact, it's pretty evil. The standards of these television programs that are now becoming global in their reach are much lower than the sort of moral standards in some of these Muslim Hindu countries. So it's being resisted. And of course, sometimes it's being violently resisted. People in Saudi Arabia, people in Afghanistan, people in Iraq are saying, we cannot, this culture is dominating us. It's squeezing the life out of our own national and local cultures, and we must stand against it. And if we have to stand against it violently, then we'll stand against it violently. Christianity, because of the historical reality of Christianity coming from the West in the last 200 or 300 years, Christianity is often linked with this global culture. So that is resisted, because it's seen to be part of this dominating culture which is squeezing the life out of local culture. That's a huge phenomenon in the world of missions today, and how we respond to that is extremely important. Another big influence in the world of missions in the last 50 years, I guess, 40 years, has been what missionaries today would call contextualization. It's not new, of course, but it's something which missionaries have given an awful lot more thought to. And to some degree, this thought has been because of the globalization of culture. And the issue is this: when you go into a culture in the name of Jesus Christ, do you bring a culture with you? So people don't just become Christians, but they actually accept a culture along with accepting Christ. I was talking about the lantern slides that the missionaries used to bring 50 years ago when I was a child. And it was always interesting how, when you were in a jungle in Africa, the first converts' children wore Western clothes. You know, so they're accepting a culture as well as accepting Christ. And people resisting that, wanting to maintain the qualities of their own culture, they're resisting Christ because they're actually wanting to resist that culture. So we're asking ourselves in missions, what is culture and what is gospel? Can people continue to be Saudi Arabians and follow Jesus? Is that in fact a powerful thing? That you're not extracted from your community, but you follow Jesus in your community, maintaining many of the cultural qualities of your community. So let me tell you a little story about Bangladesh. I have a couple of friends who went into Bangladesh, must be 30 years ago now, and there were very, very few Muslims following Jesus in Bangladesh. There were just a handful. So they went into a village, in what is a town in Bangladesh, and they rented a shop. And they built a little wooden plinth, and they wore long white robes, and this guy even grew a little goatee beard as well. So he looked like a Muslim teacher, really. And he put his Bible on this wooden plinth, wooden thing which kept the Bible off the ground. You know, if you're a Muslim, the Quran is holy, yes? You don't put the Quran ever on the floor. It's a holy book. You don't underline it. You naughty Christians underlining the Bible. It's a holy book. You don't deface it. So he gets a bit of incense going in the door, puts his Bible on a plinth, sits in front of the Bible, and people start coming. He's their religious teacher. He's their imam. And he starts telling them about Jesus from the Gospels. He doesn't mention church. He doesn't mention Christianity. He just talks about following Jesus. And some of the men particularly, they get really interested and they become followers of Jesus. And then my friend comes back to England and he's come for a break. And I remember him telephoning me when he was back in England. And he said, things are going really well, but I think the problem will be baptism. None of these guys have been baptized yet. And I think the crunch will come when we baptize them. Any advice? I said, no. Don't know how you should go about that. So then he went back to Bangladesh and I got what did they use before faxes? Telex. I got a telex from him. So you can tell how long ago it was. And he said a remarkable thing happened when I was back in the UK. I don't know what you think about this theologically. But one of the guys who had become a follower of Jesus had read about baptism in the Gospels. So he'd gone down to the river and baptized himself. He'd immersed himself. And then he called all the men who had become followers of Jesus and he baptized them as well. So baptism had taken place within the context of the village. There was no sort of Western missionary influencing them. Last year, or the year before, I'm terrible on time, it could have even been 5 years ago, I'm not bad. I was in Bangladesh and I was speaking to 420 leaders of groups of Muslim background believers. Some of you might know the name Stuart Briscoe, you know that name? The well-known preacher. He'd been there 2 weeks before speaking to 600, he's much more popular than me, 600 leaders of Muslim background believing groups. So that's 1,020 leaders of Muslim background believing groups. And that's all in my missionary lifetime. From a handful of Muslim background believers to at least, and there's probably a lot more, 1,020 groups of Muslim background believers. Most of those believers would not call themselves Christians. They wouldn't say they attend churches. They would be followers of Jesus. And they're still in their communities. They're still accepted in their communities. And they're able to influence their communities in the name of Jesus. One of the problems of missions historically has been what we call extraction evangelism. So missionaries go in, no criticism of missionaries, this was the way it was done. They go in, they build, what did they do? They build a house, a hospital, a school, and then they put a wall around it. It's the missionary compound. And then people get converted out there, and it becomes a bit difficult, you know, they're getting a bit of persecution. So the missionaries bring them into the compound, give them a job in the school or in the hospital. What happens? They're extracted from their community. They're not able to witness in their community because they're seen as different, they're seen as becoming part of a different culture than their own. So there's been a great deal of study over the years as to what is gospel and what is culture. I think that's something European churches could really derive a lot of benefit from thinking about. What is gospel and what is culture? Contextualization. So many things I could talk about. I guess another big thing in the world of missions is the growth of short-term missions. Now, we talk about short-term missions today, and everybody has embraced short-term missions. It's one of the phenomena of missions. But 40 years ago, 50 years ago really, when OM began, short-term missions was completely strange. You went to the mission field for life, didn't you? Yeah? Everybody gathered around the ship as it left, and we sang, "God be with you till we meet again," and off you went. And you were allowed back every 4 years for a furlough, but it was a lifetime calling. And then these guys came along and they started talking about short-term missions. That wasn't a very good thing. But of course it's become a huge phenomenon in missions today. It's become a very, very valuable part of world missions. It's got pros and cons, it's got good things and it's got not so good things. The good things of short-term mission is that people coming short-term often hear the call of God to go long-term. So it's about 40% of people involved in long-term missions today who began with a short-term mission experience. So almost every missionary society you ever come across has got a short-term program because it's one of the great recruiting methods for long-term missions. Equally good is that it shows some people they're not cut out for long-term mission. It's an equally good feature of short-term mission. You know, if you previously felt called to mission, what would happen? You'd go to theological college for 3 years, wouldn't you? And then you'd go to language training for a year, 18 months. And then you'd go to the candidate school of the missionary society you were working with for 6 months. You're talking 4 years of preparation. I wonder how much money is involved in that. 40,000? 50,000? 60,000? And then you go to the mission field, and the number of people who didn't survive the first term, 4 years, first term, was challenging. Missionary societies didn't publish the statistics. But many missionaries who went through all of that training just couldn't make it, for various reasons, on the mission field. There's two problems there. The major problem is the missionary feeling of failure. He goes back to his church and of course they accept him and they try and be kind to him, but he feels a failure. That's a huge thing. Then of course there was the expenditure, 50, 60, 70,000 to get them to the field, and it's not long before they return. So many missionary societies today recommend short-term before you go long-term. Go and have 6 months there. You know, experience it. You can hear messages about Bangladesh, you can see pictures about Bangladesh, but it's best to go and experience the culture yourself for a few months and decide before God, maybe with your family, with you, whether that's a long-term option for you. Another big positive of short-term mission is the job that short-term missionaries can do. The job that short-term missionaries can do is very much dependent on the cultural jump that you're making in that short-term mission. For example, I'm English, I learn French at school. Go to France on holiday often. So the cultural jump for an Englishman to France is not a big jump. I mean, frog legs for supper, okay, it's a bit different, but it's not a big jump. So you'll find that English Christians can go short-term to France and they can do a major job in 2 years. They could plant a church often in 2 years, an English group of short-term missionaries. Because the cultural jump is not so big. You've probably got the language to some degree, the culture's not too different. But if I, as an Englishman, go to, let's say, Japan, that's a huge cultural jump. I'm probably not going to know the language to any degree. The culture is so dramatically different from my culture. I'm not going to plant a church in Japan in 2 years. I might be able to do other things. There might be a missionary who's learned the language, understands the culture, do short-term mission on that cultural jump, but it will be a very, very different kind of short-term involvement. So if you're ever thinking of short-term, that's a thing to think, what's the cultural jump I'm making here? Because that will make the job that I'm able to do very, very different. Another great advantage of short-term mission, of course, is discovering your gifts. You will find, if you go on short-term mission, I'm sure many of you could testify to this, that in a short term, 6 months, a year, you will be involved in a host of things that to get involved in local church life would take forever. Just the nature of things. You arrive on a short-term team, somebody needs to look after the accounts, so you become a bookkeeper. Somebody needs to cook the food, so you become a cook. We need somebody to look after the children, creche. In a very short period of time, you find yourself doing a large number of things. And that's very often how you discover your gifts and calling, isn't it? You discover your gifts as you get active. You know, the Christian who sits thinking, I can't do anything because I don't know what my gifts are. So I'll wait till I discover my gifts and then I'll know what I can do. No. Get doing things, and as you do things, you discover your gifts. You'll discover areas where you're effective and where you're comfortable, other areas where you think, wow, this is just not me. So when people come back from short-term mission, that's the primary blessing, I think. They find areas of ministry that they can concentrate on for much of the rest of their lives. There are some drawbacks, of course, in short-term mission as well. Major mistakes have been made over the years because of that cultural jump. There are horrendous stories of short-term missionaries who've gone into Muslim lands, carrying with them names and addresses of long-term missionaries in that country. They've been taken in by the authorities because they haven't understood the culture and how you work, and the names and addresses of long-term missionaries have been found. Horrendous stories like that. So there are some drawbacks in short-term mission. I think another drawback of short-term mission is, particularly when you're making those big cultural jumps, if you want to do many things, you find that nationals and long-term missionaries have to look after you. You can't speak the language, so they have to go with you and interpret. If you want to preach, they have to translate for you. So men and women who are trained, understand the language and the culture, they've got the gifts, they can't use all those things because they're looking after short-termers. Another big issue for short-termers is expense. I mean, you can go to Nepal for a month and that might cost you $1,000, $1,500, $2,000. It might not be much for you, but for a national in Nepal, they think, wow, $2,000, that's 2 years, 3 years, 4 years salary for me. And that imbalance can become a big issue in the world of short-term missions as well. Overall, however, short-term missions is making a huge positive impact on Christian missions generally. Another growing phenomenon over the last 50 years is what we call tent makers or non-professional missionaries. People who go into mission, but missionary is not on their passport. You can't say tent makers is a modern phenomenon because the first one was the Apostle Paul, so it's not a modern phenomenon, but it's a growing phenomenon. Because, of course, you can't get missionaries into many of the countries where we want to go. If you have mission on your passport, you can't get into those countries. So tent making has become ever more important in the world of mission. Again, there's pros and cons. If you're a tent maker and you go into a country, you're often seen to be making a contribution to that country, which is a positive. If you go as a missionary, you've got, people think of you in a certain way. If you go to make a contribution to teach English as a foreign language, you go to Saudi Arabia, as a friend of mine has done, to work in the oil fields of Saudi Arabia. You're making a contribution to that country, so you're well accepted. You then have an immediate circle of friends around you, those that you're working with. Sometimes, it's not often the case, but sometimes you also have a very good salary. So you don't have to raise funds in order to be a missionary. That's not always the case with tent makers, but sometimes. So there's some positives, some negatives. Many churches don't recognise tent makers as missionaries. It's amazing how slow the church has been to recognise tent makers as missionaries. So they won't pray for them as much as they pray for proper missionaries. They don't think member care in the same way as they might think that for proper missionaries. Often also tent makers, particularly in Muslim lands, you find Westerners tend to be pressed together into a sort of Western ghetto. So you go to live in the community, infiltrate the society, but actually you find yourself restricted. They insist that you live in an area where mainly Westerners are living. You also find a lot of tent makers getting exhausted because they go to do a job and they want to do it really well as a Christian, but they also want to be there to witness, to disciple, to help plant the church or grow the church. So it can be a very exhausting business. Another modern phenomenon of missions is what we might call churches sending missionaries. So, miss out the middleman. Why send people through Operation Mobilization? I mean, they take their percent for administration. You know, it's a lot cheaper to send people directly to the field from the church. It's cheaper. We don't have to lose the administrative percentage that you have to cover the administrative costs of a big mission like Operation Mobilization. And you can get people to the field very quickly. You often find there's a real sense of support from the church. If the church is the only group supporting them, they're not being supported by a missionary society as well, there seems to be a real sense of support from the church. The drawbacks, of course, are there's no experience on the field. So you land up on the field as an individual and you're not immediately associated with a community who've got experience of working and operating in that field. You often find there's no pastoral support for you, whereas if you're with a missionary organisation, there probably is. There might well be isolation because you're not connected with some society. You often find that these individual missionaries sent from a church also go to plant a church of that denomination. So they're not going to build the kingdom of God, they're going to plant a denominational church, sent by their denomination, sent by the church, to plant a church of a similar type. That's been a big phenomenon in recent years. Let me just mention one other phenomenon, and then we can throw this open for questions. It's an ever more important phenomenon, and that is the internet evangelism. So we are finding more and more internet missionaries today. People who spend many hours on the web, in communication with people in lands which you just couldn't go into as a missionary. They're in chat rooms, they're in correspondence by email with people who are seeking after God. That's a growing phenomenon in the world of missions as well. I was in Dubai a number of years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, talking to missionaries working in Saudi Arabia and the surrounding Gulf states and so on. There was 120 of them came out for 4 or 5 days of Bible teaching. It was a great joy to give them Bible teaching, but it was a bigger joy to me to hear the stories of what God is doing in that part of the world. One story really stayed with me. It was a story of a couple in Saudi Arabia. Both of them extremely intellectually gifted people. They were both doing their PhDs, and one of them, the final year of his PhD, this was a married couple, the male, the husband, final year of his PhD, he went to America to study in an American university. And was contacted by Christians while he was in university, taken along to a church, found Christ. Went back to Saudi Arabia, couldn't talk about it, because he didn't know what the consequences of talking about it would be. So he never talked about it to his wife or 3 teenage children. Meanwhile, his wife is doing her PhD and spending quite a bit of time on the internet in her studies. And Christian sites keep popping up. And she gets more and more fascinated by these Christian sites. Gets so fascinated that she starts printing some of the material off, that she buries it in the bottom of her desk drawer. She wants to hide it in case her husband sees it. And this goes on for 3 years. And after 3 years, the husband just can't contain himself any longer. And he says to his wife, have you ever thought about the teachings of Jesus? And she dashes to her desk and gets this pile of papers out. And he leads her to Christ. They lead their 3 teenage children to Christ. And they think we are the only believers in Saudi Arabia. And they're desperately lonely. And they're walking down a street in Jeddah one morning, out for a family walk, feeling we're the only Christians here in Saudi Arabia. And there's a missionary couple walking up the street, feeling, what on earth are we doing here? We just can't break through and talk to Saudis about Jesus, and if we do, we're probably going to get thrown out of the country. And they meet this family and they start chatting. And the end of the story is a long story. And the end of the story is that this missionary family, who were in Dubai with me, were spending 2 or 3 hours every day discipling this Saudi family who thought they were the only Christians in Saudi Arabia. So God is using the internet to reach people and to disciple people in the name of Jesus. If any of you have got time on your hands and you like discipling people long distance, there's opportunities to do that today. So those are just some of the changes taking place in the world of missions in the 30 or 40 years that I've been involved. And we can expect that those sort of changes will continue. Everything we are being led to believe leads us to the conclusion that the globalization of missions will continue. Chinese are coming, the Africans are coming, the Latins are coming. The globalization of missions is going to continue as the years go by.